My people, listen. They say that when a heart breaks in absolute silence, the universe keeps the receipt, waiting for the day the debt must be paid in full. I was a girl who carried a graveyard of stolen dreams behind my eyes, a student whose mind was a golden palace that the world insisted was only a ruin. My name is F. In the burning heart of Lagos, where the sun beats down on school uniforms like a relentless judge, I became the girl that hope forgot. I studied until the kerosene in my lamp was a memory and the ink on my fingers felt like a second skin. I knew the answers. They danced in my head like living fire. But every time I sat for an exam, the air around my desk would grow unnaturally cold, as if a ghost were exhaling on my neck. As I opened my graded test today, the red F looked like a jagged scar across the page. Then, the impossible happened. As my classmates began to howl with laughter, the black ink of my correct answers began to shiver and melt, running off the paper like black tears. I looked up in terror, but everyone was too busy mocking my failure to notice that the paper was literally weeping. The pattern of my life was a heavy, invisible chain that I dragged through the corridors of the school every single day. I did not give up. I was a daughter of the soil, and I believed that if I poured enough sweat into the earth, a harvest would eventually come. Every afternoon, while the other girls were busy painting their nails or talking about the latest songs, I buried myself in the library. I wrote notes so clear and beautiful they looked like they had been printed by a machine. I felt a tiny, flickering spark of hope, a belief that this time, the world would finally see me. But the school library had a darkness that no light could reach. When I would turn a page and then look back, the words I had just written were gone, leaving the paper as smooth and white as a fresh bone. My handwriting simply vanished, leaving nothing but the ghost of an indentation. I felt like I was losing my mind, a girl chasing a sunset that moved faster than her feet. From the corner of the room, near the shadows of the tall shelves, the school janitor watched me. He didn't speak, but his eyes held a weight that made my breath catch in my throat. The teachers were like judges who had already decided on the hanging before the trial had even begun. To them, my failure was not a mystery to be solved. It was a character flaw that deserved a lashing. They saw my empty papers and my blurred answers as proof of a lazy spirit and a wandering, useless mind. F, you are the shame of this classroom, one teacher would bark, her voice cutting through the humid air like a whip. There are children in the slums who would trade their souls for the desk you sit on, yet you treat this education like a burden. I wanted to scream that I was trying, that I was fighting an invisible war, but my voice was a small candle in a great howling wind. The weight of their judgment was a heavy stone around my neck. One day, during a quiet study hall, a teacher walked past my desk and stopped suddenly, her face turning pale. She shivered, pulling her sweater tighter around her shoulders. "There is something wrong with the air at this desk," she muttered, her eyes darting around as if she felt an invisible presence. But then she shook her head and walked away, choosing the easy lie over the difficult truth. While the teachers looked at the chalkboard, the janitor looked at the floor, where the secrets of the school gathered like dust in the corners. He was a man who moved through the hallways like a shadow, unnoticed by the loud and the proud who thought they ruled the school. He saw the way the light shimmered and twisted around me when I was deep in thought. One evening, after the school had grown silent and the lights had been dimmed to a low hum, he entered the classroom where I had been studying. I had left my notebook behind in my rush to escape the cruel whispers. He picked it up and held it toward the fading orange light of the sun. On the pages that looked empty to everyone else, he saw faint, ghostly streaks, like the trails of snails made of liquid silver. He watched as they pulsed with a dim, unnatural light before fading completely into the paper by morning. He knew then that the girl was not failing because of a weak mind, but because something in the very foundations of the school was stealing her light. He touched the paper and felt a vibration of deep, icy envy. He knew the hunt had begun, and I was the prey. A glimmer of hope is a dangerous thing. It makes you walk toward the cliff even when the wind is screaming at you to stop. A major exam was approaching, the kind that decided the fate of a student's entire future. I told myself that this would be the day I broke the curse, the day the world would finally see F. I memorized every formula and every date until my head throbbed with the weight of it. I entered the exam hall with my chin held high, the janitor's quiet gaze following me from the doorway. As the clock began to tick, I felt a sudden surge of power. The answers flowed from my pen like a river of liquid gold. I was doing it. I was winning. But halfway through the test, the air grew thick and heavy, like I was trying to breathe underwater. I looked down and saw my answers vanishing from the paper as soon as I wrote them. It was as if a hungry mouth was opening in the page and drinking the ink. Panic seized my heart, and I began to gasp for air. I tried to rewrite them, pressing so hard the pen tore the paper, but the void was faster than my hand. The supervisor only looked at her watch. The world of the digital age is a cruel forest where the wolves hide behind glowing screens, waiting for someone to stumble. My failure at the major exam was not kept in the quiet of the principal's office. It was broadcast to the whole school within minutes. Classmates took photos of my tear-stained face and turned them into memes that traveled across the internet like a plague of locusts. The jinxed girl, they called me. The girl whose brain is a black hole where knowledge goes to die. Every time I opened my phone, I felt a fresh knife in my heart. The mockery was a constant roar that followed me down the hallways and into my restless dreams. Even my most supportive friend, a girl I had shared my deepest secrets with, began to drift away into the safety of the crowd. I saw her in the hallway, and she looked at the floor, her face red with a mixture of pity and fear. She was afraid that if she stood by me, the wolves would turn their teeth on her too. The social media mockery was a wall of ice that cut me off from the warmth of human kindness. I realized that public humiliation is a slow poison. Rumors in a school are like smoke. They seep into every crack and corner until everyone is choking on the lie. The whispers changed from mocking my intelligence to fearing my very presence. "She's cursed," they whispered as I walked past, their eyes wide with a dark superstition. The school won't let her pass because she brought a dark spirit with her from the shadows of her village. I became a ghost in a building full of people. Students would move their chairs away from me, and the air would grow silent the moment I entered a room. One afternoon, a girl accidentally brushed against my books as she hurried to her next class. Suddenly, she tripped on nothing and dropped all her papers into a muddy puddle of rainwater. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, as if I had pushed her with an invisible hand. "She brings misfortune," she screamed, pointing her trembling finger at me. The whispers turned into a chant of fear. I felt the guilt rising in me like a tide of black water. Was I the cause of their pain? Was my desire to succeed drawing a shadow that was hurting everyone around me? The intrigue of the curse was becoming a cage. But the janitor saw what the children were too blinded by fear to notice. He noticed a pattern that was far more sinister than a simple village curse. He saw that the students who mocked me the loudest were always the ones who suffered the most. A boy who had posted a cruel video of my failure tripped on the marble stairs and dropped his expensive tablet, watching it shatter into 1,000 useless pieces. A girl who had laughed at my blurred paper suddenly lost her voice during a major choir performance. These were not random accidents. They were the hidden cost of the negative energy they were throwing at me. The janitor watched from the shadows, his broom moving in a steady, ancient rhythm. He realized that the envy and the judgment of the school were feeding a hungry force that lived in the very walls. Every time someone threw a stone of mockery at me, the force grew stronger, and it demanded a payment from the one who threw it. The moral complexity of the situation was a heavy burden. I was the victim, yet my presence was the trigger for a cycle of pain that was spiraling out of control. Suspense was building. Desperation finally drove me to seek a hand to hold in the dark. There was a classmate, a quiet boy who had never laughed at me, and I reached out to him for support. We were assigned a group project together, and for a small moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe if I worked with someone else, the shadow would stay away. We sat in the library, the golden sunlight filtered through the trees outside. He was kind and patient, and for an hour, the world felt almost normal. But as we began to present our work to the class, the boy suddenly froze. His eyes went blank, and his hands began to tremble. He had known the material perfectly just minutes before, but now, he couldn't even remember his own name. He looked at me with a look of pure confusion and a subtle hint of blame. The class whispered that the jinx was spreading, that I was infecting everyone around me with my failure. The boy moved away from me as if I were a leper, and I felt the last cord of my hope snap. Even kindness was not enough to stop the interference. My vulnerability had only caused more pain, and I felt like a danger. One evening, when the school was a hollow shell of silence and the shadows were long, the janitor finally spoke to me. I was sitting on the back steps, my head in my hands, wishing I could simply vanish from the earth. "It is not your fault, daughter," he said, his voice deep and resonant like the rumble of distant thunder. I looked up, startled to see him standing there in the twilight. He explained to me that my failures were not born of my mind, but were the work of a force that fed on the collective envy and neglect of the school. He told me that the more I tried to shine, the more the darkness tried to pull me down to keep its twisted balance. "But you must listen to me, he warned, his eyes boring into mine with a fierce light. "If this pattern continues, someone will always bear the cost of your success. The world is a scale, and right now, the weight is shifting toward a dark end." Relief washed over me because I was not crazy, but it was quickly followed by a cold, numbing dread. The truth was more terrifying than the lie. I was caught in a web. I tried to be clever. I tried to find a way to succeed in the dark without drawing the shadow's hungry eye. I studied in secret, in the corners of public parks and on the back of crowded buses, trying to achieve small, quiet victories. I wanted to prove I could pass a simple quiz without causing a storm. I managed to get a few questions right during a sudden pop test, and for a second, my heart soared like a bird. But the moment the teacher announced my small success, a girl sitting 2 rows away suddenly fainted, her head hitting the wooden desk with a dull, sickening thud. Panic erupted in the classroom as they rushed to her side. I sat frozen in my seat, my pen clutched in my trembling hand, knowing that my tiny victory had been the cause of her collapse. The fear of harming others became a wall that blocked my every move. I realized that there was no such thing as a small success in a place where the very air was poisoned by judgment. The courage I had gathered was turning into a weapon that I was deathly afraid to use. I was a prisoner. The school began to change as the accidents became more frequent and more strange. Students would walk into doors that were wide open. Teachers would forget the very subjects they were paid to teach. The headmaster, a man who usually cared only for his prestige, began to walk the hallways with a worried frown that never left his face. "There is something unnatural at this school," I overheard him muttering to the vice principal late one afternoon. "The atmosphere is heavy, and the children are acting like they are walking in a dream." Suspense hung over the building like a thick, gray fog. Everyone knew something was wrong, but no one had the words to describe the shadow. They looked at the cracks in the walls and the flickering lights, but they did not look at the quiet girl sitting in the back of the room. The authorities' suspicion was growing, but it was pointed at the wrong things. They checked the plumbing and the wiring, while the real danger was the envy that lived in the hearts of the students and the neglect that lived in the hearts of the teachers. I watched it all, my heart heavy with a secret too big to keep. The guilt became a monster that lived under my skin, biting at me every time I breathed. I stopped eating and sleeping, convinced that every misfortune in the school was a debt I owed to the universe. I felt like a danger to everyone I touched, a walking disaster disguised as a student. At home, the pressure from my parents was a different kind of pain. They thought I was simply not trying hard enough, and their disappointment was a cold fire. One night, I fell into a feverish sleep and dreamed of a great shadow that filled the entire school library. The shadow had 1,000 eyes, and they were all looking at me with a hungry glare. It whispered in a voice that sounded like 1,000 voices joined together in a scream. "The truth lies where eyes cannot see, You are the mirror that shows them their own ugliness." I woke up drenched in cold sweat, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I realized that I couldn't keep running from the darkness. The hopelessness was a dark sea, and I was sinking. I needed a light to show me the way out, but I was so tired. Just when I thought the darkness had finally won, a new figure appeared in the school like a beacon. Mrs. Ode, a wise mentor and a retired teacher who had seen 1,000 generations of students, was brought in to counsel the troubled youths. She was a woman who walked with a slow grace and whose eyes seemed to read the thoughts hiding behind my forehead. She sat me down in a small office that smelled of lavender and old, wise books. She said, her voice a soothing balm to my wounded spirit. The weight you carry is not your own. You are holding the shadow of 1,000 envious hearts. I felt a sob break from my throat, the first time I had let the pain out in months. She didn't judge me. She didn't tell me to study harder. She sensed the invisible weight on my shoulders and agreed to investigate the mystery with the help of the janitor. They became my guardians, two people who saw the world as it really was. She told me that the guidance I needed was already within me, but I had to be brave enough to look at the fire. Hope was a small flame. Mrs. O'Day and the janitor began their watch during the next set of mock exams. They stood at the back of the hall, their eyes sharp and focused on the unseen. As I sat at my desk, trying to write my answers, they saw what no one else had ever noticed in all those years. They saw shadows, long and thin like skeletal fingers, reaching out from the corners of the room. These shadows would wrap around my pen and pull the ink back into the nib, or smear it across the page. They would dance over the desks of the other students, stealing their focus to fuel the interference against me. Mrs. O'Day realized that the curse was not a thing that lived in me. It was a phenomenon tied to the collective envy and neglect of the school environment. The more the teachers ignored the bullying and the more the students mocked my struggle, the stronger the shadows became. It was a revelation that brought both clarity and a new kind of tension. The curse was a reflection of the school's own failures. I was merely the lightning rod for the storm they had created with their own hands. Mrs. O'Day sat me down and explained the impossible moral choice I had to make. She said, her eyes full of a sad, heavy wisdom. You have reached a crossroads. You can continue as you are, suffering in silence and letting the cycle of failure and pain continue until it consumes you. Or you can reveal the hidden truth publicly. You can take the burden of their judgment one last time to break the force. I looked at her, my heart trembling in my chest. If I spoke out, everyone would think I was crazy. The humiliation would be 1,000 times worse than failing a simple test. But if I stayed silent, the shadows would continue to steal my life and the lives of those around me. It was a moral dilemma that felt like a death sentence either way. I thought of the janitor's sacrifice and Mrs. Aid's kindness. I thought of the girl who had fainted and the boy who had forgotten his name. I realized that my silence was a kind of lie that was helping the darkness grow. I resolved to expose the truth, even if it meant I would be the most mocked girl in history. I chose. The first step was to confront the source of the neglect that had allowed the shadows to grow. I walked into the office of the teacher who had mocked me the loudest, the one who had told me I was wasting my seat. I stood before her desk, my hands clenched at my sides to stop the shaking. You saw the ink blur, I said, my voice steady and clear for the first time in years. You felt the cold wind at my desk, yet you called me lazy. Your neglect was the food that the shadows ate. The teacher looked up, her face turning a strange, sickly shade of gray. I saw the guilt flickering in her eyes like a dying candle in a dark room. She tried to dismiss me, to tell me to leave her office, but the weight of my words was a physical force she couldn't ignore. She realized that her own pride and her refusal to see the truth had amplified the curse that was destroying the school. The justice in that moment was small, but it was real. I saw her hand tremble as she reached for a pen. She knew I was right, and the realization was a heavy burden. The janitor and Mrs. O'Day began to gather witnesses for the final, public revelation. They didn't go to the popular students. They went to the quiet ones, the ones who had seen the flickering lights and the vanishing notes but were too afraid to speak. We gathered in the school courtyard as the sun began to set, the orange light casting long, dramatic shadows across the grass like pointing fingers. Watch, the janitor said to the small crowd of students and teachers who had gathered. He handed me a notebook and told me to write my name. As I began to write, the air around us began to hum with a low, vibrating energy. Shadows began to form on the ground, pointing like fingers toward the students who had laughed the loudest and the teachers who had turned their eyes away. The public accountability was a terrifying thing to witness. The tormentors saw the physical evidence of their own envy and neglect. The shadows were like dark mirrors, reflecting the ugliness they had hidden in their hearts. A hush fell over the courtyard as they realized they were the ones who had been creating the monster. The truth was visible. The day of the final exam arrived, and the entire school was gathered to watch. I sat in the center of the hall, my desk surrounded by a circle of observers. The tension was so thick I could almost taste the copper in the air. I picked up my pen and began to write. This time, I didn't fight the shadows. I simply let the truth flow onto the paper with every stroke. The answers came to me with a clarity that was like a bright, blinding light. As I wrote, the shadows began to lash out, but not at me. They turned on the students who were still whispering and mocking in their hearts. Those who held on to their envy felt a sudden sharp pain in their chests. Those who held on to their judgment felt their own memories begin to blur and fade. The consequences of their actions were finally becoming visible to everyone in the room. The moral test was not just for me. It was for the entire school. They had to choose between their pride and the truth. I saw the struggle on their faces as they watched the invisible war play out in the center of the hall. It was time. Chaos erupted in the examination hall as the consequences became impossible to ignore any longer. Students began to cry out in fear as they saw the shadows dancing on the walls like hungry ghosts. They realized that my repeated failures had been a shield that had protected them from the full weight of their own negativity for all these years. Every time I had failed, I had absorbed the darkness that they had created with their words and thoughts. Guilt spread through the hall like a wildfire in a dry forest. The teachers were shouting for order, but there was no order to be found in the face of such a moral reckoning. The tormentors realized that they had been destroying themselves by trying to destroy me. The fear was absolute, but it was a healing fear. It was the fear of a person who finally sees the cliff they have been walking toward in the dark. I continued to write, my hand moving across the page with a steady, unstoppable rhythm. I was the anchor in the storm, the one who was bringing the truth to the surface. The hidden costs were being laid bare for all. In the midst of the chaos, the janitor stepped forward into the center of the hall. He stood next to my desk and raised his hands, his old body glowing with a faint warm light that pushed back the dark. He began to absorb the shadows into himself, shielding me from the final, desperate lashing of the curse. I saw the pain etch itself into his face, the way his shoulders bent under the invisible weight of 1,000 envious hearts. He was taking the burden of the school's darkness upon his own back so that I could finish my work. The truth can now be known, he whispered, his voice a rasping breath that carried the weight of ages. He collapsed to his knees, his eyes closing in a selfless sacrifice that made my heart break in my chest. The students and teachers watched in a stunned, shamed silence, realizing the depth of the love and the protection they had ignored for so long. He was the lowliest man in the school, yet he was the one who was saving them all. The shadows dissolved into a fine gray mist that vanished into the air. He was the hero. I took my final exam under the full observation of the entire school. The air was clear and calm, the shadows were gone, and the silence was a respectful, holy thing. I wrote every answer with a joy that I had never known in my life. The knowledge flowed from my mind to my hand without any interference. When I finished, I put down my pen and looked up. The supervisor didn't look at her watch. She looked at me with a gaze that was full of awe and a deep, aching regret. The climax had passed, and the truth had won the war. The shadows had hesitated, then vanished, revealing that the hidden cost was the loss of our own humanity. Every student in the hall saw their own reflection in the clear light of the morning. They realized that my success was not a threat to them, but a victory for the soul of the school. The moral test was over, and the school had survived, but it was changed forever. I walked out of the hall, the janitor's quiet strength still echoing in my soul. I was no longer the girl who could not pass. I was the light. The public revelation was a shock that rippled through the city like a thunderclap. The story of the jinxed student became the story of the school that had lost its way and found it again. Former tormentors came to me in the hallways, their heads bowed in shame, offering apologies that were thick with tears and sincerity. They had to confront the reality of their own envy and the damage their neglect had caused. The teachers stood together in the courtyard, their voices quiet as they discussed how they had failed their most basic duty. The collective guilt was a heavy cloud, but it was the only way to heal the deep wounds. I saw the boy who had forgotten his name, and he looked at me with a smile that was finally real and free of fear. The invisible interference was gone, leaving behind a school that was finally a place of learning instead of a place of judgment. The truth had been a painful surgery, but it had saved the patient. I felt a sense of peace that was deeper than any exam grade. We were all seeing the world clearly for the first time. My success was finally recognized publicly in a way I never thought possible. At the graduation ceremony, my name was called first, and the applause was a roar that shook the very rafters of the hall. I stood on the stage, the gold medal of honor around my neck, but my eyes were on the back of the room where the janitor sat in his humble uniform. He was recovering, his strength returning slowly day by day, and he gave me a small, knowing nod of pride. Mrs. O'Day stood beside the headmaster, her face full of a quiet, fierce triumph. The emotional payoff was a wave of relief that washed away the years of mockery and pain. But even in the joy, there was a warning. Mrs. O'Day pulled me aside after the ceremony and whispered, "Remember, power and envy always demand a price. This victory was bought with courage and sacrifice. Never forget the cost of the shadows." Her words left a haunting aftertaste in my mouth. I realized that the battle for justice is never truly over. It must be fought every day with empathy. I was a graduate of life. So, my people, as the sun sets over the rooftops of Lagos and the city lights begin to blink like stars, I stand quietly by the school gates. The janitor is back at his work, sweeping the hallways of the new world we have built together. The school has changed. The whispers are now words of encouragement, and the judgment has been replaced by empathy and love. But the world outside is still full of shadows and people who choose to see only the surface of things. I teach the younger ones that unseen suffering carries a price that everyone must eventually pay. Empathy and awareness are the only weapons we have against the darkness. I look at my medals, but I know the real victory is the light that we keep in our hearts. What would you have done if you were F? The choice is always yours. Walk in the light, always.